So Marley didn't want to go out yet. So at some point I'm going to take a break, but maybe
Okay, I have to turn off some audio. I'll be right back, okay?
Okay. So at some point I'm going to, maybe I'll check in with my phone and take it for a walk with me, but I'll be listening either way.
Yeah, I'm gonna bail about 12:15 because I've got to be someplace at 1 o'clock for a group gathering.
Oh, nice.
But I'm going for a walk in the woods. An autumn
Very
walk
nice.
in the woods with the groups.
So you're getting outside more now?
Well, this will be the first time that I've gone outside for an extended period. It's over near Walden Pond. There's a bunch of trails in that neck of the woods, and we're going to go in that neck of the woods for a walk in the woods.
Very nice.
But no, I really have not spent enough time outdoors, walking or doing anything as much as I really should. Walking alone, you go out for your daily constitutional, it's kind of boring because, what are you going to do? Put on a headphone and listen to WBUR. What are you going to do? Nobody to talk to when you're out walking alone. So.
Well, you can meet people.
Well, not where I go walking.
See, I have a dog.
Yeah,
So-
I live in a neighborhood, it's a bedroom community, and if I go for a walk around the block, which is a big, long block, I won't run into anybody.
Yeah. Hello.
Hey.
I was just saying I'm going to check out at some point because I haven't walked the dog yet. He doesn't feel like getting up yet, but
Okay.
I might come in on my phone so I can listen.
Alrighty. Oh, look at that. Glenn is here today.
I just let him in.
Glenn will be here today.
Hello, Glenn.
Glenn, haven't seen you in a while. Okay.
His audio is probably not in yet.
He's
Yeah,
just
no.
suggesting it.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay.
Good to see you guys.
Yeah, and I will bail in about an hour and 15 minutes because I have to be someplace at 1 o'clock here today.
Okay, cool. I can actually be here for the entire 2 hours, but then I am meeting someone for a pickup. So I won't be on past the 2-hour mark myself. All right, now that we got those constraints out of the way, any check-ins? Who that?
Well,
Kayla.
I'll just say hello. I haven't been here for a couple of weeks. Been pretty hectic. So yeah, finally a quiet weekend.
Oh, good to see you again.
Yeah.
Well, I have one topic that actually burned its way into my brain recently, so we'll see if it's of interest to you guys after a round of check-ins. There's Josh. Okay. All right. So 1, 2, 3, Kayla, Joshua, Glenn, Stacy, Barry, myself. Okay.
Oh.
Okay, go ahead, Stace. You had one.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, for a while I had pulled back from speaking to certain types of people, thinking that, it's really not worth my time. But I'm really feeling that there's a certain audience, particularly Republican women, that I want to start engaging with. These were people that before 2015, we all got along. You couldn't tell who, had what political leaning. So for me, that says there's something that we connected on. And I think that if the framing of certain issues were changed, there would be a lot of agreement. So I'm I'm still going back and forth with whether or not I want to do that, but I feel like I really do. I like that role. So that's where I'm right now, still trying to, decide, should I, shouldn't I?
Okay.
That's my check-in.
Anybody else want to check in? Because I definitely have a response to that one.
I think I have a little thought I could share, which may be related, but it occurred to me that a lot of the communication dynamics that I see on social media that is, let's say, less than optimal, especially these political conversations, it occurred to me that they don't really have a context in a sense. It's like it's like a lot of topics that are just floating in the air, and there isn't a context where there's a purpose for the conversation, and there's no specific problem to be solved. There's no specific people one wants to help, for example. So it's a lot of those topics, they seem to be kind of floating in the air in a sense. And I was wondering if maybe that's a part of the issue. And it came to me, this thought experiment, because I've always liked playing chess, the game of chess, and I'm kind of interested in it. And it came to this thought experiment to me that, let's say you put a group of chess players together in a room, and that instead of them just playing a bunch of games and having fun, that's one possibility. And the other possibility is you give them a specific position to analyze and find out what's the best move in this specific position. And I think that both of those two first scenarios would be, pretty useful in different ways. But then let's say you have a third scenario and you ask them to discuss, is knight to e4 a good move? And you don't give them a position. You just ask that question generally. And I'm pretty sure every chess player would immediately say that's a totally meaningless question because there's no position here. And if you said, well, in general, what would you say what are the pros and the cons of moving your knight to e4, right? And it would become a totally meaningless discussion right from the get-go, and you could almost be certain that a long time later, nothing productive would come out of it. And you could almost be certain if you give them 100 years, still wouldn't have come to anything sensible with that framing. And I thought that thought experiment was pretty good, because it occurred to me a lot of the political debate on the internet seems to be those kinds of things. It's some kind of weird decontextualized concept that's just put there, and people obviously mean all kinds of things to it. They have different situations, and it's like the whole framing in itself just almost guarantees that nothing productive will come out of it. And then obviously there's then the real context, and I guess, is the attention economy, and the fact that these ongoing debates that never lead to any resolution is actually a lot of media companies and people making money from this and making a living from the fact that these debates never reach any conclusion or any resolution at all, right? So it's like the whole thing is designed to just go on and on and on and on, and it's just designed to not really lead to anything sensible. So yeah, so that was just a thought I had lately, and I think it might have a little more than a little bit to do with this political discussion that's happening in the United States.
Thank you, Glenn. I really liked the point you just made, and I really think that adds a lot to the understanding. Kayla, then me.
I just wanted to check in with everybody because you allowed me the opportunity to. First of all, I'm going to be in and out for video because I've got a ton of stuff to do. Second, just on that point of political stuff, it's funny. My coworker, so I don't know if you guys know this, but I'm working on a FEMA grant specifically for the COVID-19. And I had no idea that the organization that I work with is pretty heavy into politics and lobbying. And what they do is they're advocates for family members in the community. So my coworker has been promoted to an advocacy position, and the reason why he was promoted is he's got exceptional leadership skills. And then working with him, we all recognize that. But he was sitting, we were just having, a general conversation, and he said, I have no idea what the hell I'm doing. And he was saying, I don't know about the laws. I don't know about like these senators. And the horrible part is, I don't care. And so it was really interesting to me that they would promote somebody who has absolutely no interest in politics whatsoever. So I'm sitting here and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so great. You have this opportunity to lobby at the state capitol. And he's like, I don't give a fuck. I don't know where to start. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is problematic on so many levels. I mean, not only are our politicians retarded, but we've got people that we promote in good faith who have exceptional leadership skills that do not have any interest, in what they're doing except for a paycheck. And so I started thinking philosophically, and I'm just like, oh my God, this is like wrong in like a million different levels, but here I am busting my ass, working 3 jobs, including my own business, trying to do what I love. And, where is that kind of fine line? And then how do you get into the issues where you can help the community? So that was just kind of musing on my mind. But other than that, on a personal level, I've got a shit ton of stuff to do. I will listen as best as I can. And the good news is at the end of the day, I'm going to a pub crawl that is Halloween related. So you will see me with braids at some point in this session. And then maybe Josh can take a picture or something.
Are you gonna put on your blood makeup?
I am. I'm going to put on my crazy, I don't know, makeup. So I am complete.
Thanks, Kayla. Wow, this is an awesome start to the session. There's been a lot of good stuff here already. So I think I have about 4 or 5 points. I started with 2, but then everybody started saying really cool things. First comment, and let's go back to Stacy's comment. I do wonder the very same question, because everyone who's out there either spreading a misinformation or spreading these conspiracy theories about the election, or about anti-facts, anti-science, there's a huge component of that that, in my opinion, will not respond to reason. Those people believe what they believe, not because of reason, but because of who they associate with, and maybe what families they're part of and what communities they're part of. So I think for me, it's actually useful to think whether or not reason will work with someone. And you can tell fairly quickly. And if it won't, either I will disengage or I'll try something else. Now, when I was younger, that something else would mean I might actually be very pokey, like, I would mock. In fact, I still sometimes do that, okay? It's part of my personality defect, okay? I like to mock people who can't really appreciate truth and science, and that's not the greatest approach to try and connect with someone, okay? So that's point number 1, is to really understand whether these people respond to reason or not. The second thing is, every one of these people has a mother or a sister or a daughter or a spouse who is enabling this behavior. So it's bigger than specific individuals. It's this whole network of how do families actually let this happen when, let's say, politicians are actually creating policies that are actually not beneficial to their sisters, their wives, their mothers, their daughters. What do they have going on that makes that okay? Or do they even understand those effects? So I really do have those questions in mind. And even before the 2020 election, some of you recall, I tried to invite open, calm conversation with people who supported Trump, didn't get very many takers. And I reported my experience with a couple at least, okay? Glenn, your point about context is an excellent one. It's so excellent that it ties back to why, in my opinion, a dynamic knowledge repository is so necessary. That you can't have these little islands of belief or these islands of thought without really understanding, okay, so what's the basis for that thought or that claim? What's the evidence? What's the counter evidence? How do you then balance all of that together to actually understand? And then you trace that back to its foundation. You know, each of those points has its own foundation. So this very large internetworked, you call it epistemology, theory of knowledge, or you call it, provenance, the path for which this truth gets spread. And that to me is foundational to why Doug Engelbart and myself and others appreciate what we're calling this dynamic knowledge repository, to which, by the way, I add another D, a distributed dynamic knowledge repository, because we're now in the age of electronic world and everything being connected by the internet. And Kayla, that brings me back to your point, which is if this person, I don't forget what his name is. If you don't want to name him, I'll just call him Ted. If this fellow Ted, your boss or a coworker, doesn't really care, what strikes me is most politicians actually have advisors and counsel around them. So if he doesn't care and he's actually willing to listen to, let's say, you or your friends or whomever else, to actually say, hey, why don't you take this position because, and then you lay it out for him. That might be one way to make that person effective if he himself is not willing to take a position or, do the research himself. Okay, so my last point is really the point that I wanted to lead with, because all of this is connected. Barry, I'm especially interested in your feedback because you like thinking about these things. But in many contexts, and I admit it's obviously too simple, but let me just introduce it as a simple model, okay? What happens in the world happens as a result of what people do, right? You act, and then there are results that are plainly visible. If you don't act, they're different results, but they're still results. Okay. Now, that's what's observable. What's observable is you act, and there are results in the world. What's not yet today observable is what drives those acts. And you like to think that it's reason, and you like to think that it's logic. It ain't necessarily so, because a lot of what drives those acts is pure emotion. Okay. Now, what affects that emotion? Because we already know that emotion affects how you act, and therefore indirectly affects the results that you see around you. Okay. But those emotions are driven by what you allow yourself to think. So there's a thinking component that drives the feeling component, that drives the acting component, that then generates results that we can observe. Okay. And that thinking stuff and that feeling stuff mostly, although we're getting better at it, mostly is invisible. It happens inside someone's brain or mind, okay? What's visible is the actions and the results. And what's not visible so much is the thinking and the feeling. Now, obviously, it's not that simple a sequential model. They're all going on at the same time, but you can sort of see the influence that we, and by the way, this all then recurs again because those results then affect what you think. You either observe it, which is clearly thinking about something, which then affects how you feel about it, which then compels you to act or not act, and then generates a whole new set of results at a delta T. Okay, so that TFAR, thinking, feeling, actions, and results. At least those four components. Let's just keep it to those four for now. Okay, is a simple model which I think can go towards helping us understand certain behavior. I will admit up front, it's probably not complete, but it's probably not far wrong in most cases, is what I'm thinking. Okay. So this is what I'm trying to do, to tie together everything that people have brought together, because, you know, underlying this is this current that's going on for 4 years for me about truth, about science, about critical thinking, about systemic thinking, and then about impact. What we, or I as an individual, or we as groups, can do to help the world become a better place for all of its denizens. So I wanted to sort of bring those themes together and introduce this simple model and see how people might poke at it, how people might say, hey, it helps me understand certain things, but especially in Stacy's case, where there's a lot of people who just respond based on how they feel and who they associate with, and they don't care quite so much, or apparently don't care quite so much, about long chains of reasoning and long arguments based on evidence and data. I really do see a large set of people who don't care about any of that. Witness coronavirus, witness the vaccine, witness legislation, witness history, witness all this, you know, stuff about Holocaust denial, slavery denial, all that crap. So anyway, that's how I wanted to, at least for now, pull that together. Thank you for allowing me to speak this long. Over.
Yeah, I want to jump in because there's just one part of that model that I have to push back a little bit on, because yes, I think sometimes what you believe affects your emotions, but what I'm proposing is that, and these are the people that I want to reach. Yes, there are some people, they're already in an emotional state, which causes them to reach for those things. So the reason I'm even weighing whether or not I want to speak to these people is I know that before politics came into it, I liked them well enough. And I know myself, I wouldn't like somebody that was totally rigid and unreasonable. I know that about me. So what I want to do is I want to get through the emotion. I want to move the emotion out of the way. That's the first step. The reframing is part of that, but I'm not even looking to change anybody's opinion. I just want to clear out the emotion so that they can just let the information come back in and then decide. But the important thing is it's both ways. Sometimes the information leads to the emotions, but not all the time. Sometimes it's the other way.
Agreed.
I think a key parameter in the TFAR model is a person's time horizon for making a choice. If you're a scientifically minded person and you're used to doing model-based reasoning, then you want models that can anticipate the outcome of an action, not just in the next day or hour, in the long term. And so if you have a very long-term time horizon for your thinking, you might go for delayed gratification. You might say, if I do something effortful, some work, something that's even going to involve a little pain, I will do that if I can anticipate a payoff in the future. If you don't have the faculty of model-based reasoning with the long time horizon, then you're much more likely to make a choice that says, I want a near-term payoff. I want something that's going to make me feel good today or very soon. And I have no idea what's going to be the long-term time horizon. So you have your typical thrill seeker who will say, I want to do something exciting and thrilling. And okay, maybe there's a risk and maybe there's a probability that something bad will happen in the long term, but that's sort of out of sight, out of mind. Whereas a prudent person will say, okay, I could go for something that's exciting and thrilling today. What's going to be the long-term cost? And is the long-term cost going to be such a downside that I will forbear today? So time horizon, I think, is a very important parameter to consider in how a person chooses an action, whether they're feeling driven or thinking driven. And that means model-based reasoning for a longer time horizon.
Okay, I think I see my hand up. so I'll go. Yeah, that's another point which I don't think we talked about very much here. At least I haven't brought it up. Maybe others have, which is this notion of tenures and their durations for politicians, and especially these people who are in there for life. It seems, the president, for example, has a 2-term limit, but senators and Congress people can be there for life, and therefore, they're effective when big money, whether it's pharma or oil or dollars or whatever, gets into their pockets. They're very effective because they stay there for a long time. And so these idea of term limits, which is one of the things that we're trying to get past now, is so important. If you cannot, the standard question we ask is, let's say a House representative makes about 170 something $1,000 US per year, okay? And many that come into these positions with average assets, looking at their 1040s, those are their tax returns. And then they end up being millionaires soon thereafter. Look at the Clintons. They're a classic case of that. How do you become multi-decade billionaires, being a governor of Arkansas and being a senator or being a representative, after only 1 or 2 decades? It's clear. We gotta figure this out. And there's no transparency to it. So it's called lobbying, but it's really bribery. So I think you've brought another very good element to this, which is this time frame. And if the US plans on 4-year timeframes, and I argue it's not even that, okay? Because it's for your election timeframes. It's not really, any bigger issue than that. It's just, can I get elected again in 4 years or 6 years, okay? But I'll point out yet again that the Chinese have a 50-year planning horizon that they update every 5 years. So they don't just, set it, forget it for 50 years. Every 5 years, they look at what's going on 5, 10, 15, 20, blah, 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 all the way up to 50 years out. So guaranteed, they're looking at what do they do for space investment? What do they do for undersea investment? What do they do for relations with Russia? This is how they get these treaties signed with Hong Kong that go out 99 years. They've got this long planning horizon. They have a sense of time that most other nations, particularly the US, doesn't have. I'll just tell one more story since I'm ranting right now, okay? When I took a political science class as a senior, just to round out my general education, okay, before I graduated with a math degree, I took a political science class from a fellow named John Kennedy, who's a political science professor at Stanford. And my paper topic, which I researched for the entire quarter, if not longer, okay, was Taiwan independence. What happened with the history of Taiwan, how it was claimed by the Dutch, then it was claimed by China, then it was claimed by Japan, then it was given back to China after the Second World War, and yet how it was really emerging as its own democratic nation, although it got kicked out of the United Nations in 1972 or something like that, because Nixon wanted to kowtow to the Chinese. So Taiwan has been kind of this in limbo state, not a member of the United Nations, and yet still one of the very few prosperous and successful democratic countries in the entire world. So after I wrote this, and I wrote this thing about how many people had gotten into prisons for political dissent, this professor said, I didn't know any of this. This paper should be published. And I was kind of proud of that. So I shared it with my parents. My parents said, you can't do this. If you publish this, all our relatives still on Taiwan will start disappearing, because that's what happens to political dissidents. They start disappearing. So I was not allowed to publish that paper by my family. The Chinese think in very long time frames. The people who think in that culture can wait. They can afford to wait. They've got the size, they've got the presence to outweigh almost anyone. And if we don't take that time frame into our systemic thinking, we're totally ineffective, completely ineffective, regardless how many dollars we've got, regardless how many people we got, regardless how many PhDs we've got, totally ineffective if we don't have that planning horizon. Over.
I guess that if that's going to happen, it's very important. This internal division in USA isn't so prominent. It seems that it's practically impossible to have long-term planning if you have two blocks that are so dedicated to just winning above of one another and ruining the other block's good work. I guess that would just make it impossible, wouldn't it, to do any kind of long-term planning? It's kind of my impression from seeing it overseas. That's really the dilemma for USA.
Wouldn't you think that the people in the Middle East, at least, would appreciate that, hey, this is a long-term issue, and we have to take a much more considered, much more systemic, much more long time frame context, like Barry points out, into how we deal with the Middle East?
Yeah, sustainable thinking makes sense, but it's extremely rare. Very few people, very small percentage of the adult population can engage in sustainable thinking to devise plans and practices which are long-term sustainable. It's much more common for people to adopt practices which are beneficial in the short term, but may mortgage the future of their grandchildren.
Not entirely convinced of that. I mean, what about ethical intuitions? I think
It's
many
rare.
of those. I don't think it's so rare to have ethical intuitions. It's very common, but it's the one thing is to think about it. It's a different thing to be able to put it into action, especially for a society, right?
Yeah, get out.
What is ethical intuition?
Well, I mean, I think that most people have a lot of ethical intuitions that they.
But what is that?
What you could call a moral compass, a kind of conscience, a kind of sense that a sense of, there's certain lines you don't cross. There's, you don't throw waste in nature, right? Very few people do that.
And you think that comes innately?
Well, I
as
think
intuition?
I think it's a result of many things through culture, but I think it's a fact that most people have it to some degree. But that doesn't mean that they're able always to enact it. And it certainly doesn't mean that they're able to coordinate that scale to enact it collectively. I mean, that's a different question, but I mean, it's pretty clear that people do have ethical intuitions. And I think that is maybe a kind of embodied sustainable thinking. I mean, seems to be a little bit in that direction, though, wouldn't you say?
I have my hand up. Anybody else?
I just want to point out that people worry, and worry can be an ethically driven worry, but often it's just anxiety because they don't have a clue what's going to happen.
Okay.
Not a premonition of this is not going to end well. They don't have the premonition this is not going to end well. They say, I have no idea what's going to happen. So they have worry.
Okay, I'm going to propose something. I'm going to express something I've never expressed before. Okay, and I believe I've never heard before, but I'd like some feedback on. Okay. To me, I'm going to propose the following definition for intuition. Intuition is the mind's attempt to do systemic thinking when one doesn't understand all the elements, but knows that it's kind of congealing in a certain way.
Yeah.
I'm going to propose that as a definition for intuition. So to me, with that definition, it's definitely affected by what one ingests, what information, what facts, what observations, what teachings. That affects one's intuition, I believe. A baby doesn't just come into the world right now and say, okay, I know not to throw trash in the forest. I don't believe that. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
But most people can't say, well, here's the 17 different things I considered, and here's the 14 different databases that support those 17 things, and therefore this. Okay. They can't do that. So they say, my intuition tells me blah. But all of that stuff is rattling around in their brain or in their, knowledge repository somewhere. They just haven't really drawn that diagram or come up with that model or really, understood how each of those elements affects these others in systemic ways. But they just sort of let this rattle around and say, it feels more like that. Which could be wrong. It could be right. Mostly right. Okay. Because it's probably been rattling around there for a long time. That's my current understanding of intuition. Over.
It saves time, right? It's faster, much faster.
Yeah, but it's a question of whether you care about efficiency if you don't know about the efficacy. Okay.
Oh, you never know everything.
I would define intuition.
But you can if you ask. You can do better.
I would define intuition as a kind of an inchoate theory or inchoate model that you have sort of the beginnings of an understanding of how things are going to play out, but you haven't written it as an express model or an express theory in a public language. And in my work at Bell Labs, the hardest thing for me to do is if I had an intuition about the solution, what's the optimal thing to do, the hardest part was to elevate the intuition from an inchoate hypothesis or inchoate theory or inchoate model to an express theory, an express model that I could then write down as a mathematical model or some kind of an analytical model that I could then reveal and then test and get people to say, yes, that theory, that model, that hypothesis seems to be correct. But before it's expressed, it's just inchoate intuition. That was the hard part, elevating into it. Sometimes I had to invent the language. I mean, Newton had to invent the language of the calculus. Somebody can throw a baseball and expect it to follow some kind of a arc, but it took Newton to figure out, how can I write that model down as a parabolic formula and show that that's correct. And after that, people can say, okay, now I get it. Now I see why I should aim the cannon at this angle and get the cannonball to out at a certain speed. Before that, it's just an intuition. Oh, just aim that way and throw it that hard. So it's getting an express model from an inchoate version.
Right, and I think I think that's consistent with my proposed definition, which is nobody wakes up with an intuition about how to aim cannons. Right.
Exactly.
You have to assimilate a lot of information before you got that intuition that it's got to go this angle if I want to go that far. If I want to go this far, I want to go that angle. That sort of thing.
You got to throw a lot of baseballs before you get the intuition.
That's right.
Yeah. I think we're pretty much on the same page here with regards to this word, because it definitely is a lot of previous experience that kind of accumulates into an intuition.
Okay, so for me, the important thing, if at least the three of us seem to agree, I'm not sure about the other people on the call, but if the three of us are at least allowing this hypothesis to at least simmer for a while, then here's the one thing that I would like to point out, okay, is that people who rely on their intuition to become their source of truth, to me, that is open to question. Because if we say that intuition is affected by what you hear, what you see, and what you're taught, what you read, okay, then clearly you can be manipulated by your parents, by your society, by your church, by your neighborhood, by your school. All of those things will affect what you call your intuition, which then results in what you call your truth, my truth, that person's truth. And that's where I'm really trying to lean into and say, I don't yet see a lot of validity for those claims. Yeah. And the people who actually make those claims about my truth, subjective truth. And so those are the people, in my opinion, who are dangerous because they're not questionable. You can't question them.
So basically the point is then that if you have a whole system of really misinformation, a misinformation ecology like you have with politics, where very few people have access to high quality information, and most of the transmissions are more or less dishonest and superficial, then the intuitions that people form over time are not going to be reliable.
Right.
I think
Yeah.
that's quite obvious.
There was an example in the Nobel Prize recently. If you have a qualitative model, you think that something affects something else in a qualitative manner, but you don't have the quantitative relationship. So they thought, well, if you raise the minimum wage, it'll be bad for the economy. Well, then a couple of economists did the quantitative model with some experiments and found that the quantitative model didn't agree with the qualitative intuition. And so going from qualitative intuition to quantitative models, that's a huge upgrade in terms of the reliability of an intuition, the precision of an intuition.
I love that point. I love that point. That is one of the ground axioms under which I am calling this thing called global sim, which is your model, my model, everybody else's model should be shareable, should be tweakable.
Right.
So that I can start with a qualitative model. You can bring in some quantitative expression of it.
Right.
I can tweak it. You can tweak it. A third party can tweak it. And now you got a lot of exploration going on, but we have to share data.
Yeah.
Your data has to test my model. My data has to test your model. And the best models will then be reused by others.
Yeah.
And composed into bigger and better models. So this is why I really think this language of how we reason together, how we model together, how we create these predictive models that can then be executed and tested. That's the fundamental premise of this thing I call global sim.
Yeah.
Because if you can then use that to influence your decision-making, your acting, then we are way ahead of what we do today, which is the loudest voice with the best looking face wins. That's a poor way to make decisions.
Exactly.
About billions of people and trillions of assets. Really poor. And we haven't learned to level up yet. And I think this thing called global sim or something like it is an attempt to level us up. Not everybody, but at least 3% of us. That's what I'm looking for. Or 300,000, somewhere in that range, 30 to 300,000. Over.
Yeah, that I think that's very, very interesting idea, global sim. So yeah, I would love to go a little into that idea at some point, because I think that is kind of the crux of the matter. One question that came up for me was when you say a predictable model, how does that fit with, let's say, good behaviors that tend to produce good outcomes? Is that a model that's predictable, or just
you could predict that solid engineering is the difference that makes a difference. Look at the history of rocketry. They had the idea of a rocket all the way back to the Chinese fireworks, but the engineering to control a rocket so that it went without just blowing up in the sky, which is what they all originally did. The engineering was down to some very precise mathematics and some very precise control theory and control systems. And so the engineering is where the hard work was done, not the idea that you can fire some gunpowder and shoot a rocket in the sky. That's obvious. But how to calculate the mathematics of it so you can engineer a functional rocket, that was decades of very hard work by very unsung engineers.
Right. But that's kind of the easy part, right? But the difficult part is the social stuff. And how can we create a culture where there is an emotional atmosphere that is maybe different, that doesn't bring about this division. How is that created? Can we have a model for that, or do we need a different approach?
Yeah, Kennedy thought if we landed a man on the moon, it would jumpstart the space age. He was right about that.
Yeah. Well, Glenn, I think I was anticipating your question, or at least my version of your question, by introducing this TFAR model. Okay. Because part of it was really to address the fact that reason and data is not, in many cases, the driver for how people think and behave. It's feelings, it's association, and it's, most cases, not very sophisticated, right? It's reactionary. It's at the level of, I'm hungry, therefore I'll eat. But, a more systemic approach would be, okay, well, therefore, if I have a more longer term planning time frame, I know when to go to Costco. I know how many refrigerators I need. I know how to budget. I know how to, order stuff off Amazon so I don't have to drive, or some other site if you don't want Amazon to get your dollars, or, et cetera. Or I can, do a co-op with my friends so we can share, all that sort of thing. That would be a more considered approach with a longer time frame than I'm hungry, therefore I'm going to go eat 5 cookies.
Or my seed corn. I'll go eat my seed corn because I'm hungry today, and screw next year.
Right. But how is how do we create a culture of trust, for example? How is that created?
Track record.
I think my answer to this, and I know I'm doing a lot of talking right now, okay, you're not going to have trust unless you have an appreciation for truth.
Right.
If your basis for trust is who someone else pointed to, or who's loudest, or who's, living in that, spire building down the street, okay, then I don't think we can actually develop this kind of trust that is scalable. I think you need that to be based on truth. And that's why, to me, I would question every attack on truth.
Right.
It's very important to me. Because so much of anti-truth, anti-science, anti-reason, anti-questioning, anti-back and forth, anti-rational conversation / thinking / general collaboration, that's the basis for my truth, their truth. There ain't no such thing as objective truth. That is the crack in which society is going to fall. That's the crack where society begins to crumble. It's when we lose that appreciation for truth.
So all of that is obviously, when the word truth is used in those contexts, I mean, it's obviously a very nonsensical conversation. But I think it's an interesting point. How could we create a real appreciation for truth? Not this crap that people are talking about, but real truth. I guess you would need to change the emotional state, because this is from my experience. If I'm in a fearful emotional state, then truth is dangerous. Everything is dangerous. Everything is perceived as, or perceived as overwhelming. It's too much to take in, right? So if the ground emotional state is tense, fearful, then this isn't gonna happen. But if the emotional state, if you have more space, if you have more energy, then you can view the unknown with wonder. Because the unknown is important, because most of truth is unknown. Even the smartest people, they know very little and understand even less. And that's just a fact. So if we're afraid of the unknown, there's never going to be any appreciation for truth. And if we're going to approach the unknown with curiosity and wonder and openness, then we have to initially be in a different state. So this is why I'm, there's many ways into this, but I think this is necessary, right?
What I think we need, if you go into college, you can take a course in art appreciation or music appreciation, even though you're not studying art or studying music to be a producer of art or music. What we really need in college is science appreciation courses, because not everybody's going to educate themselves to become a scientist or an engineer. So the people who are not going to become proficient in those really ought to be afforded science appreciation courses. I mean, you can go to the movies and you can find an art critic or movie critic that will, tell you what they thought of a piece of entertainment. Try to find somebody who will give you a criticism of a piece of science. I know a few who are very good at it, Ethan Siegel, for example, but you'll find a lot more people who are art critics or movie critics, and very few people who are science critics who can give you a very good insight into the quality of some science that you ought to pay attention to and appreciate. So I'm a big fan of more, both in high school and college, science appreciation.
So I'll go further than that. One of the reasons I don't believe democracy is the best solution is because everybody's allowed to vote.
Including,
I think people who cannot understand reasoning,
right,
people who cannot understand science, cannot understand the foundations of truth, ought to be given less influence. One of the ways I would like to try, okay, and I think the obvious implication, which is not where I'm going with this, is don't let people vote if they don't believe in truth. That's too difficult to implement, okay? But I do believe it would be very interesting to institute a system where I can actually do a very fine-grained level of delegating my proxy on an issue-by-issue basis. Let's say I'm not familiar with marine biology, but I know this particular community is, or this person is, so I delegate them my vote on marine biology matters. And if something else is about, let's say, coronavirus, for example, I can say, I will delegate to this organization or that individual my voting rights, and my proxy goes to that entity or that organization.
Right.
I would like to institute something like this. That way, the people who are active, who are really knowledgeable, and who already have influence in their communities can gather the proxy of those who trust them. That, to me, it will at least be almost an inarguable improvement in the current system, which is anybody given 3 seconds of looking at a pamphlet and being able to recognize where's A, where's B, and knows how to make a mark, is allowed to vote. That's a crime against society, that you should be able to vote that arbitrarily, in my opinion.
So you think you can get rid of representative democracy, that people vote for representatives?
I think it's a evolved form of representative democracy, not the current form. It's a more evolved form now that we have the technology to do so. Heiner's got his hand up. Welcome.
Yes, Sam, I fully resonate with you. And I would like to recommend you this paper I shared about dot democracy. How they, through making all these dots in design thinking, have been really nullifying and misusing the voting process. I'm fully resonating with you that you should be able to delegate voting, but what we do with structured dialogic design and my magic roundtable is to do it dynamically, that you as the expert, the stakeholder, can be part of it, but you also can influence and give it to real experts and do it in a democratic, very dynamic process. We have done it in Germany, what you call in America, citizen jury, that you have representatives. So all this is there. I just wanted to say hello. I'm a little bit late and I have to go out again. This is hectic times for me. Since 2 weeks, another 4 weeks, are now at the Entrepreneurship Summit, and I'm dashing off for the climate negotiations in Scotland at the COP26. But the topic should really be maybe revisited when I'm back. I'm just greeting. It's been 24/7, a really hectic time here at the Audi Max at Free University. And to show you that I'm not lying, here is the Free University exhibition. And we are down there in the Audi Max. And we do a lot of serious gaming and serious drinking and talking. This is my part. Over and out.
Thanks for checking in, Heiner.
Beautiful place. Yeah, I'm not exactly clear about what this idea is of this alternative voting system, but the first thought that comes to me is that the thing that I would be most qualified to vote about would be what is needed in my life situation. So I wonder if there could be a system, kind of a distributed system, where people could, access what they need. Maybe remove some middlemen. I don't know. Not quite clear on this yet, but.
Okay. So not seeing any other hands up, I'll go again. To me, this decision-making process is more than just voting. I'm not just delegating my proxy for votes. I'm delegating my proxy for the creation of options. In other words, why is it that we have special interest groups here in the US? We're funded by obscure money sources to create legislation that automatically just appears on a legislator's desk, but represents the interest of unknown sources that then get introduced into legislative bodies without their derivation really well understood. It's kind of created in secrecy. So to me, the process of creating those things that we want to decide on, and by the way, not just 2 options, there ought to be a whittling process of thousands of options, and my proxy being able to evaluate which are the best, and other people's proxies working together to say, out of these 10,000, we got to look at these 4,000 or 400. And out of these 400, let's whittle it down to the next 27. Out of those 27, let's narrow it down to the last 3. And if there's serious disagreement, any of those, there's forking and merging and reappraisal and remodeling going on at all stages. So that by the time real choice is necessary, whether it's A, B, or C, or A and B, we know by transparency, by our proxies, and by sharing of all of this reasoning and all this knowledge that's been distributed in a DDKR, we know why those options are the best. And I would say in that time frame, you can probably say, let's do both, or let's merge those into a even a better option. There's got to be a process by which we do that. But this whole veil of secrecy behind who comes up with A versus B, and then millions of people, possibly even hundreds of millions of people, choose only between A and B, and they don't really understand how A and B were created in the first place. That's not a good system for society. Over. Barry, you got your hand up.
One of the failures of our democratic system is the distinction between statutory laws, which are voted on by a parliament or a Congress or representatives, versus delegating authority to a body of subject matter experts. So for example, you've got the FDA or the FTC or the National Weather Service. So in some cases, you take a supervisory responsibility and you create a body of subject matter experts who are responsible for managing that part of the economy, as opposed to a statute, which is created by a bunch of legislators, none of whom are subject matter experts on that issue. And I think the solution is to go more and more to creating bodies, what you call an authority, transportation authority, health authority, safety authorities, who are people who really know what the hell they're doing. And they're recruited because of their subject matter knowledge. They're not voted on. So the legislation should be to create these organizations, the NIH and so on, as opposed to having a bunch of legislators have a statute about when you can get an abortion in Texas. That's a corruption of the rule of law,
Right.
in my judgment. Sam?
And I think speaking for people who probably are not able to participate here, I'm hearing now voices that say, we do that, but those bodies of experts are themselves already biased and already under influence of corruption. And so I want to dispel that notion. I think that we have to have a notion of truth first.
Yeah.
Then people who can practice critical thinking, scientific method, model-based reasoning, systemic thinking, all of those together, okay? And to then have, if you have this set of attributes, this is how you behave, this is how you act, then you ought to be authorized to create options and possibilities that then get presented to everyone else.
Yeah.
But if you don't, you should not be given as much of a voice.
Yeah.
So we're back again to the need for cultural evolution.
Yes. We need to evolve. And I think still the first point of evolution is restore trust in truth. Restore trust in reason, in scientific method, in observation. And that has been successfully under attack by those who want to corrupt the thinking of society by attacking the truth. And by the way, light workers play into that. Light workers who still say, oh, there's my truth, are allowing different forms of truth to be in the conversation. So they're essentially giving credence and credibility to people who have alternative truth, alternative facts. I think light workers are dangerous in this regard.
What's a light worker?
A light worker, I mean, look, I mean, people use that term.
Yes.
Many people who call themselves light workers are all kinds of different stuff. I mean, basically it means someone who's conscious, who's living a good life. It means just what Sam is saying that we should strive for. That's the meaning of the word being a light worker.
But it's often abused.
Yeah, but it's used in all kinds of ways by people for all kinds of reasons. And a lot of it's pretty crazy.
Look, associated words are things like enlightened. Okay, if people are enlightened, people are spiritual, people are woke. God, what a word. Okay. Those people have this smugness based on intuition that theirs is the way.
It's one yet another arrogance, form of arrogance, right? Others have pugness because of their degree, because of some other. People are arrogant. That's a part of the problem, isn't it?
Yes.
People
Arrogance
think
is
they know
only a
more.
problem to the extent that it prevents reasonable interaction. Other than that, I don't care if somebody's ignorant. Arrogant. I can deal with somebody's arrogance so long as they're still open to conversation and dialogue and reason. I won't let that arrogance get to me. But if that arrogance, it gets in the way of being questioned, of really, digging deeper, defining terms, understanding, effects and reasons, reasonable chains of conclusions, then that person is arrogant and non-approachable and is therefore outside the realm of collaboration / critical thinking / being accountable.
And we're back again to the basic issue of being able to think impartially and reasonably and be able to have a fluid mind and change one's mind and so on, which is a very advanced state of consciousness to be able to do that.
I think what Sam opened with the narrative that I have, which is controlling the narrative, is what's going on. They do it through hook or by crook. And if science will work, they'll use science. And who are they? I don't know. Who are the others? I don't know. And if I ask they and the others, what is better, what would that list look like? And then why did they give me that list? What's the antecedents to that list? And what you're going to find is culture. And hospitals for people who have actually, probably through their culture, I think it was Christianity who did a lot of work on charity. And now we have modern hospitals. We have people arguing in the Western world around their version of what it means to be a Bernie, sociocrat, what do they call it?
Social Democrat.
Yeah, like
So many
saying,
versions of those. So many
yeah,
versions.
and some are awful, and while they're going to the hospital, sending their kids to school, they're complaining that they're not going to be communist and do what the government says. And so when you think getting together as a group of people trying to make things better is to be equated with some dirty word out of a philosophy book, there's not a real conversation going on. Because Barry didn't even know what you meant by light worker, right? And so I think that's what it comes down to, having ways to make sure that conversations aren't manipulated unnecessarily. There's a lot of manipulation that's needed that you're talking about, Glenn, and Sam's talking about, but there's also unnecessary manipulation. And the fear that any perfect philosophy, especially utilitarianism, would remove the humanity from life to make sure that we're moving fast enough, producing enough. So you have to be very careful what you want. I think some of the messiness is required for humanity and the emotional realm to exist, because if we're just going to be put onto an assembly line of efficiency, and I guess when I try to dream of this better world, all that I can really visualize is having the assets tracked, our resources, and sharing them fairly or necessarily. How do we share what we have? So I think, how do you trust people is when you know that they will share with you. And when you distrust people, you know they will take away from you. I think that's the way it started with the tribes. And now it just gets more and more complicated with national borders. And now we're supposed to vote for a system that we don't understand. Therefore, defying the rule that democracy depends on an informed public. So Sam says he doesn't like democracy because it's not an informed public. And they're still voting anyway. So it's about manipulation of the narrative, I guess. Thank you.
So you touched on trust, which I think Glenn brought up first today. So for me, that is also foundational for why the 4 practices that I call the COI, to me, are so central, okay? For me, I would trust someone if they're very clear and accountable to themselves on how they are doing good. If I know how Glenn defines or conceives of goodness, and that he's accountable to himself for being good and doing good and spreading good, and that accountability includes a practice of looking at past behavior, where it's had its intended results and its unintended results, and he's willing to revise his behavior and thinking in accordance with that feedback. I trust that individual, because I know that if I've got an issue with that individual, like Glenn, on any matter, that openness will create that possibility for exploration of, what I've observed. I want to be the very same way. That's why I say, if those 4 practices are something you embrace, I'm more inclined to trust you, and therefore to interact with you, to converse with you, potentially to collaborate with you. That to me is the core of COI. Over.
Another thing that I'm kind of hearing in what you're saying is seems to be a need for transparency if this is going to work at scale. So, all these ideas, transparency is needed. And for real science to exist, real public science, there has to be a transparency of data. It has to be accessible to the public, not just to experts. It has to be accessible to the whole public. It would be a whole different knowledge system. And I think that's what's needed to be created.
Yeah.
And but it has to be a knowledge system maybe that can go beyond some of the dogma of so-called scientific minded people. If it turns out that the whole meme of let's say materialistic science, this belief that matter is foundational, for example, or this belief that the world is governed by laws rather than, let's say, viewing laws as more like habits, is some of these deep epistemological assumptions. If it turns out a few of the assumptions are wrong, maybe everything that's built on it is wrong. This is what Rupert Sheldrake talks about. And he wrote a book called Set Science Free, or The Science Delusion. And he says that, most of scientists, they share a certain belief system. They basically view the universe as dead.
As what?
Dead. And that life exists here among people, and maybe there's a gray area, but then most of the matter out there is just dead, lifeless, unconscious. And that's what he says. Okay, maybe it's an overstatement. I'm sure not everyone would subscribe to that view, but his view is basically that the epistemological foundation of modern Western scientific materialist thinking is this view that almost the whole of existence is dead, and then there's a little bit of life here, which we don't know exactly how it emerged. And it creates this subject-object separation between me and the world, and it creates this tendency to view the rest of the world instrumentally, like a resource to be exploited rather than essentially a part of myself, and so on. I mean, it's fairly foundational questions, but I think it's worth mentioning if, you know, those people who are very scientifically minded are not willing to very seriously examine some of these assumptions, then they will not be credible. We won't believe them. The public won't believe them when they say that they want evidence and facts and truth and all the rest. They will be viewed as hypocrites because they, to some degree, maybe are hypocritical. So you see, we have to be really mercilessly honest with ourselves, I guess, if we're gonna really get to this real appreciation for truth and this true, you know, culture that's built around true, appreciating truth and transparency and so on, you know. Then you know, somebody like Richard Dawkins, he has to change his tone. You know, he can't. That doesn't give science a good name. I'm not talking about what he talks about biology and memetics. That's really great stuff. But when he talks about, you know, oh, look there, new style. Okay, well, anyway, this is a sort of a big thing, but I think it's, you know, it's a part of the issue, right? That if these materialist thinkers are so arrogant and so stuck in these assumptions and not willing to question, you know, whether, you know, maybe they're completely wrong in the foundation, you know, then basically it's not going to be credible, this whole project. Yeah, that's what I wanted to just say.
I have to leave now, but
Sam, you have to unmute for us to hear.
Sorry. I know Stacy's got her hand up, but I'm just going to do 3 seconds and then I'll come back to it, okay? I want to introduce this notion of eventual transparency versus radical transparency, but I'll let Stacy go first. Stacy, you're on mute.
Okay, so I was listening the whole time as I was walking. I just want to share a short story because it touches on a lot of what I want to remark on. So I think I mentioned before that I had helped to overthrow a corrupt board and property manager at a condominium unit that I belonged to, and I wound up becoming president. When I first came into the role, there was an ongoing contract dispute. We were supposed to be getting in a new elevator, and it was going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars for an assessment. And I wanted to go to a different company because the whole deal was shady, and it was gonna cost us a lot more in the long run. The software was proprietary. And it was a small condo complex, 43 units. I had gained the trust of some of the people. That's how I became the president. But for many of the people, I was that Jew from New York who couldn't follow the rules. And, you know, I don't know if you've heard the phrase condo commandos. It's sort of like they're really into rules and enforcing the rules in a very strict manner. So what I had to do, though, is I wrote them a letter and I did all the math for them because they were screaming. We're going to lose $50,000 because we were going to lose $50,000 that we had put down as a down payment a couple of years ago before the market had dropped. And so I wrote down how much we would save going with the new contractor, what it would cost for the next 5 years. It was over $100,000 that we would save in the short term, losing $50,000. And it was hard for some people to get the concept, but enough people understood the math that everybody else came along. And I bring that up for a couple of reasons. One has to do with trust. And one of the things that also has to change is, I forgot what was said because I was walking, but we have to also renew trust in power, not just trust in everything else. And there's an arrogance or a lack of transparency in the academic community as well. And I bring that up because there are millions and millions of people with untapped cognitive abilities that could be part of this process that are not. That's where Trump tapped into, and that's why he made such progress. So, you know, we might hear the idiots, but they're not all idiots. There's some very smart people there. Recently, a book came out about the Farm Bill, and I would love to read it, but it costs $30. Now, I don't blame the authors. The authors deserve to make money for going through and basically writing a handbook for dummies, which we all need, because we need to know specifically what's in there, why it helps, why the people that are against it are against it. It's not just, you know, people aren't always against something just because of their lean. There might be a good reason why they're against something in a particular way. And maybe it could be shaped a little to take those concerns, you know, to take those objections into consideration.
Excuse me.
I believe that media should be for the people. That's something that I think can and should be financed by government, but still independent. I should be able to have access to the same, first of all, I think the people in Congress need to have to sit through and hear every single part about the bill. And you know what? While they're doing that, I could be listening in. The same way we do these kinds of Zoom calls, I don't have to be on screen, but I could be listening to the same explanations instead of having to like tune into C-SPAN where everybody's using it, you know, as if they're an actor on stage. I want to hear, why is this measure in? Who needs this measure? Who's going to be hurt? I want to hear the discussions. That has to do with education. That has to do with the media. And that has to do with creating trust and truth. So as far as getting to truth, though, I don't think we can get to truth until first we have to get to trust, because otherwise we cannot clear out the emotions. So you can't even have a conversation. And in terms of arrogance, somebody who is arrogant is not listening 100%. So it's not a question of, well, as long as their arrogance doesn't get in their way. Their arrogance automatically gets in the way. It might be to a lesser degree. Oh, absolutely. It might be to a lesser degree. But if somebody is arrogant, they are not usually looking for where they might be missing something. If they were, they wouldn't be arrogant. And I'm complete.
That's what I meant by arrogance, by the way.
So I'll go.
What you just said.
I like that point you just made, Stacy, because the reason I made that comment about arrogance yet still being open is I watch carefully Jordan Peterson videos. Many people call him arrogant. I can even see why many people call him arrogant, but I don't find him closed to reasonable conversation. I think he's actually very willing to take on criticism and address it to the point where I think some of the people who've addressed him have shown their own hypocrisy.
So maybe he's not arrogant.
But a lot of people accuse him of being arrogant, though.
That doesn't mean it's true. Confidence and arrogance are not the same thing.
Yeah,
Agreed.
he's not
A lot of
But
double speak here. A lot of
when
double speak.
people call people other labels, then sometimes you just got to address them, okay? Because it's out there in the internet dumb, whatever it's called, okay?
Do you
So
think
anyway-
he's arrogant?
I actually don't think he's arrogant
So why would you listen to other people that are saying he is?
because it's
instead of your
out
own
there.
opinion?
And the labels you use are not necessarily the labels I'll use, okay? But it still is out there and needs to be addressed. Just like this word truth, just like this word light worker, they're out there. And so we have to deal with these notions, these concepts,
There's a
because
lot
they
of stuff out
influence
there.
people.
There's
They
a lot of stuff
influence
out
people.
there.
They
do.
influence people. That's why we have to understand what those notions mean.
Okay,
Okay.
but to me, I'm hearing something that's off because I'm hearing you accept something as truth In this
No, I'm not
example, that
accepting
he's
it's true.
arrogant.
I'm saying it's out there. I didn't say it was true.
But then we first have to say, is he arrogant?
No, I don't. It's enough for me that a lot of people call him arrogant. So you have to understand there's a distinction. We're not talking
It's,
necessarily with people who call him arrogant, but I do know that a lot of people do.
Right, but I'd be more interested in looking at why they're calling him arrogant. That's where the truth lies.
Agreed. Agreed.
Well,
Agreed.
he, if people hedge their bet, one of the problems I have with Jordan Peterson is that in areas that he's not an expert, which none of us are experts, which is religion, we don't know the mind of God, if there's a God. And he has a lot of sociology that is very well founded, and he has a right to be very assertive about it, especially short with people who are wasting his time that aren't at his level of understanding. If you call that arrogance, well, that's your problem. He's earned that.
Exactly. Exactly.
Now, number two, when he does get into religion, he's not getting arrogant. He says, I don't know, but it seems to me. I appreciate that. And then he goes on to say a bunch of stuff that that might influence people that I think is full of, you know, transcendent crackers or whatever he's into. The word is transmutation, I think, or transubstantiation, you know, for the Catholics, when they take a cracker and it turns to the blood of Christ. Like, he makes statements like that. I think there is this, and I think there is that, but he's not saying I know. And therefore it's not arrogant. It's still influencing the narrative. I still don't like it, but I know that I could talk with him and challenge that. And he'd say, well, I don't know, but you don't know either. So I know it would be a stalemate, which I think is a sign of a fair conversation. What do you do after the stalemate? Very, very important.
Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to return to another point, which Glenn made. I don't want to drop this point about Jordan, but this is kind of an interjection on my way towards addressing something that Glenn talked about, which is this transparency notion. I do think transparency is necessary because accountability, I think, is what prevents hypocrisy, at least one of those items, okay? Now, some people don't care, okay? They don't care about accountability, and those people can easily be hypocrites. But that's why if we look for accountability, we can quickly spot the hypocrites. Now, to look for accountability, it's seemingly obvious that you need transparency. But I know that a lot of people are uncomfortable with radical transparency because they still value privacy. Unfortunately, the world is not a safe place where we can just not care about our privacy. It's not that safe yet, okay? So I think there's a notion of eventual transparency, which is different from radical immediate transparency. In other words, if you say everything needs to be on the record and everything needs to be visible to everybody, that's one notion of radical transparency. But this auditability notion, which a lot of organizations live with today, which is, hey, I have the right, for example, to send in an auditor to verify your behavior and your claims at any given time, eventually, okay, might be sufficient. I'm not clear that it's always, but it might be sufficient. In other words, if I can say, I trust you, Glenn, but part of that trust is you've agreed that at any moment I can send, Deloitte, over to audit your records and your behavior and all the video of your 24/7 life, then I'm comfortable with that. Okay, I might exercise that right once in every 100 individuals I work with, okay? But to know that you're holding yourself accountable and having that record and being open to that auditability might be enough for me. So this is a notion of eventual transparency, not immediate radical transparency. And I think it is enabled now with ledgers. Ledgers and crypto and, the way that technology's introduced distributed ledgers makes that possible. It's expensive, but it's possible. So I think this notion of eventual transparency is what I wanted to introduce. Over.
Just one sentence, Glenn. I just want to say one sentence. I actually think that would work, but I just want to point out, I think that's sort of why the notion of God came into existence, this whole idea that you're being watched. So it kind of runs parallel to that, you know. Go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah. That's an interesting one. Yeah, this is interesting to me because I think there's a fairly good argument that can be made that something like eventual transparency already exists to a fairly large degree, and because of simply the presence of all the devices and the possibility of being hacked. It's always present. And so we all live in a situation where if we do something really terrible, it's a very big chance it's going to be discovered sooner or later. And I think it's a beautiful thing. I think it's maybe it's one of the things that's holding society together at the moment. That there's strong incentives, systemic incentives to not do terrible things. Yeah, and it's an interesting thing. Like, what would be an information society? Let's say that there were cameras everywhere, and all the information was stored everywhere. It still wouldn't be physically possible for anyone to see everything, obviously, but there would be some kind of a long-term transparency in the system. And I think that is one of the byproducts of the information revolution, of the fact that all of these machines have appeared and are such a big part of our lives, that in a sense, everything is stored. And so this is one of the sources of hope that I have, that if you have a global system that's globally transparent, then there's going to be an evolutionary adaptability of genuine all-win systems. So if you have a system that appears which genuinely serves the interests of 100% of the people in the world, then that system can act openly, and it can communicate openly, and it will be invulnerable to criticism, because if it makes a mistake, then it immediately will correct that mistake. So yeah, this is a big topic. Radical transparency in the sense of eventual transparency. And yeah, there was another point I wanted to make as well. Thought about this for a while. Imagine that one day you're going to have lie detector tests that are totally reliable. And then if you have one of those situations where it's word against word, this is very often, a case. For example, when there's these interpersonal things that have happened, but or things that have happened way back, or whether you had an intention of doing something and so on. So if you have lie detector tests that are totally reliable, maybe that could be one of the factors that could create a systemic incentive for truthfulness, because you'll always have that, up your sleeve, so that if you're falsely accused of something, and you know you're falsely accused, you always have that option to go to that lie detector test, to do it publicly with the most rigorous technology, and you can say, yeah, this is what happened, this is how I remembered it, and the test confirms it to be true. And you know, that's a really powerful obstacle against false accusations. Yeah, I'll just put that in, leave it there.
I want to follow up on that one with just a small point. I think that, you know, you're right about the fact that we do have billions of devices now. So there's this accidental recording of a lot of stuff. But I think that's different from just declaring an alignment and accountability oneself, okay? And just being accountable to self and to others, that takes you above this accidental level and really makes you, you know, transform your life, align your life the way you say you're going to live, as opposed to a bunch of other, you know, sensors just capturing your life and then, you know, pointing out where you're criminal.
Right. Then you're back to will, then we're back to
Yes,
consciousness,
yes,
responsibility, all that.
I think that's a distinction I find useful. I would like to at least make another reference to something that is foundational to my motivation here. I'm going to share my screen for a split second here, okay? And bring up a quote from, who is it? Hannah Arendt, okay? Who says the following. I'm going to share my screen, my entire desktop, just briefly, and then read this quote. And geez, where is that? Where did it go? Where did that go?
The ideal subject. Oh,
Sorry, it's the quote from Hannah Arendt. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the dedicated communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, no longer exists. That is very wise. I think that's why I really, really make a point about truth and appreciation for truth. And I look for those cases where truth is trying to be subverted. And that's where I'm going to actively put my energies against those efforts. Is that when there are influences that now allow people in masses to question truth by saying, oh, that's not my truth, that's when society begins to fall apart. And if society falls apart, we now have factions, we don't have reason, we don't have critical thinking, we don't have true collaboration. We have then, you know, us versus them. That's when we go downhill. And that's my motivation for really restoring trust in truth, which then creates more trust. Over.
Glenn, I think you liked the post that I made, and I'm wondering if you could, I don't know how to get it over here, but I'm pretty sure you liked it on my page, because I think it's really, I think it fits perfectly. Because I understand, Sam, what your desire is, and I still think it runs counter because of the emotional buildup that it actually, like you mentioned in the beginning of the call, that you do tend to mock. And yeah, that has to, you know, that has to be taken care of first. So I would say that first, there has to be some grain. Like whenever we're dealing with somebody, there has to be some grain where we could say, I could understand this, or I could connect on this, even one little tiny point, even with somebody like a Donald Trump. Like I have asked myself, where am I like him? And it might be the smallest little thing, but if as an individual, I can't find some small grain of truth in something, or not even grain, truth in the sense of where I can connect to. That's what I mean by truth. I'm not talking about a full idea. I'm talking about something that I can say, okay, we can stand on here together and look at this. Then I'm missing something about me. Then I'm being arrogant or blind. There's something, because I mean, I can be wrong about this, but I strongly believe, since there are so many of us and we all have individual fingerprints, that every single person holds a piece, every single, no exceptions. And just, if I could just say one show, there's a show called Chopped. It's a cooking show. And the idea of the show is you must use every single ingredient. And I think that's a good thing to take with us when we're having conversations. I'm complete.
Yeah,
So-
that's
I agree with you actually in theory. In practice, though, I'm not going to be around for probably more than about 10 or 15 more years. So time is of the essence. I know that given enough time, I could find that relatable iota that allows me to sort of connect away with Donald Trump or someone else like him, or even one of his sons. But I have to choose where to put my time. And if it's going to take more than 4 years to connect with that person, I can be more effective in my own estimation, in my own alignment with good, and in my own energies and in my own life, doing other things than try to connect in such a visibly improbable person. So yes, it can come across as arrogant. I will choose not to interact with that person. I'm okay being called arrogant in that case. I'm absolutely okay being called arrogant in that case, because one has to choose where one's energy and time goes.
right. But that's
Hold
not the
Hold on,
that's
Glenn.
not the
Hold on, Glenn.
arrogance we spoke about earlier. This is something very different. You're
Yeah.
speaking about prioritizing your time, and it's impossible to communicate with everybody in the world, so we have to choose where we allocate our attention, so on.
Well,
That's not arrogance.
and that's why I start.
Actually, I think I just like put a small thing in there. Stacy says, if somebody's acting arrogant, that has to be taken out of the conversation first. And I agree with that. But at the point where somebody becomes arrogant, they may be on like a third, fourth, fifth conversation. Basically, they're handing the baton to somebody else and saying, why don't you go talk to somebody else? Because I'm done listening, basically. And that's the arrogance you feel, them making that decision. Because now if they do that right off the bat, they don't want to hear you, they don't want to listen to you, they're not going to acknowledge you, then that's filtering out without reason. So I assume if Sam says, I don't have any time today, and he's sitting there relaxing, doing nothing but meditating, and you say, well, you're not doing anything, why can't you talk to me? And he says, because I'd rather meditate than talk to you for these particular reasons. Meditation's important to me. Every time I've talked to you, it's led in disappointment. I can give you 3 or 4 examples of this. Do you really want to try again? You'll have to think about these things and mend your ways. But is it worth it to him? Right? On the 100 projects he has, is it worth him to even explain this another time to another person? So is that arrogance to actually write somebody off so you don't even give them a way that they can redeem themselves? That's another thing. So all this talk about who can vote and who can't vote, it's all filtering. How do we go from that one room to another room when somebody's acting up? That's filtering. How do we understand what Doug is saying in unblocking compared to what we're doing in barn raising? That's alignment, which includes filtering of contexts. And if people are offended by you filtering their contexts, then you have to wonder why they're triggered. So it's a lot of storytelling and emotional stuff, and you really have to lean in if you want to be honest about it. And online is not a really great place to foster that. I don't think, not radically open. I do think online's a great place to foster that stuff and use it to promote what you're doing. Sam's an example of someone taught me about being more open, and being more responsible so that you can be more open, which is kind of the lesson. But there's still some things that you want to keep to yourself. And my number one premise is that if it was so easy to find better between the different tribes of the world, then why haven't we done it? And show me how to do it. What is the list of better?
We have
Show me the
done
list
some
of better.
stuff,
Yeah,
done
I'm sure
some
there's
good
lots,
stuff.
but it'd be nice to concentrate on those.
Stacy, you had something.
Yeah, I kind of lost my my train of thought. I wanted to go back to what Sam and you were talking about and where you choose to focus your attention, because I started off the call saying my check-in was my dilemma of, do I go back into these conversations? And I want to say each one of us has a separate role to play, and it's not the same. And for me, I'm starting to think, yes, I do need to go back into these conversations, not focusing on the people that it will take me 4 years to reach. But as I said, there are people that I was connected with a few years ago, so it should be very easy to pick up those threads. But what I want to say is for those whose role is not to do that, then I think it's a question of first do no harm. Because if we're already aware of how rampant emotions are running wild, then the last thing we want to do is throw in more emotions of our own frustrations, our own angers. It just is muddying the water and making it even more difficult for people that maybe are doing what I'm doing to do it. So I'm complete.
Agreed.
Yeah, I had many things come up with this. Yeah, that post you mentioned that was belittling and mocking works against this. It says to counter pseudoscience or conspiracy theories, focus on the believer's psychological needs and invite science through the latitude of acceptance. So if you, so let's say you roll.
Do you have the graphic there? That's what I was hoping you could put in the chat.
Yeah, well, I have it here. I probably can't see it. Yeah, there we see it a little bit. But then, yeah, so the graphic is nice. And of course, that's when you're already communicated with somebody. So it's important to, that's a different thing from, whether you talk to that person or not. But if you are communicating, it sounds like a very good approach to look at what do they need, like, so where are they? See them as a human and not just as a transmitter of this bad idea. It's really just one role, right?
Right. Well, my thought was, Glenn, that if you can't follow that graph, then maybe that's a good sign that you shouldn't be engaging with the person at all.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yep, that's right. Know where the stalemates are before you get down the road too far in the first place. But people who want to manipulate the narrative, they're not going to show you that. They're going to just show you the part that works. And I think we have to do that honestly for a large degree, because every project doesn't require all of us. So you use the part of you that is appropriate for the project and try to filter out the other stuff yourself, or have other people help you filter it out, because that is your hammer and you tend to hit everything with that hammer. You say, hey, I got this. Look, we got this new tool here. It's called a database. We don't need to write it on, we can share it. Oh, here's Google Docs. We can actually collaborate and write our ideas together and they can actually grow. Oh, look, here's a thing called Wiki Notes. Or what was the thing you're using there, Sam? With all the note taking in it, Workflowy. That's it. That was one of the first he showed us. If we would have just stuck to that one and contributed to that, I think, we're all over the place, which is okay. But I think focus is the number 2 thing. So once you want to coexist and you're going to try to understand each other, then I guess you got to start to focus. and refocus in and out, zooming in and out, like Heiner would say, finding models, sharing models, running simulations of possibilities, really thinking it through instead of telling somebody like the pseudoscience. If there's some science there, then identify it. If it's just someday would be nice, then identify that and respect it for what it is. If you can't test it, you really can't test it. You can hope. And if you're religious, you can have faith. But that's not a way to truth. That's a way to opportunities. And opportunities take time. So yeah, I think Sam's idea about filtering, once you have been in the practice of critical thinking and you've been down roads of mystique many times, it does get frustrating and you do have to hand the baton off. And a lot of times when you hand the baton off to somebody else to finish this conversation with you some other way, some other day, it can come off as arrogant. It can come off as mockery, especially if a lot of time has been invested and attention, because that's wasted effort. It's disgust. I'm disgusted talking with this person over and over again, and they keep saying all you need is Jesus. It's like, yeah, you already told me that 50 times. I understand. I've read enough of the Bible. I know the decision I'm making. Why do we keep talking about this thing every time you come to see me? Right? So if they drop the religion, then we can be friends. But if they don't, they want to use that as something to filter me out, then I have to accept that. And, you know, and you have to even wonder if it's not maliciously taking your time by them trying to save you from something you're not sick of, you know, saving you from a disaster that's not happening. It's very frustrating, a lot of religious people who really do think that the earth that is going to be used by our generations to come is really just, you know, fast food wrapping on a promise to heaven. And they can do what they want with it. Now, I know not everybody thinks that way, but it leads to that kind of thinking. And that is the opposite of critical thinking. And if they start from there, like that's what I think Stacy's point that got me going was that, you know, it's an impasse. So write out what the impasse is, state the different points of view of what's better. And then what you do next is very important. Do you agree to work on that? Or do you agree to go to war on that? Or do you agree to ignore that? Build a fence? What are you going to do? Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Can I just say one thing real quick, Sam?
Okay.
1 second. I just want to suggest that in Colin's example about Jesus, that there's one more step you could take before you write that person off. You could ask them, what about me believing in Jesus would that bring? Like, how would that change things? Because they might say something like, well, then I would know that you love people. And then you could say, well, I already do love people. And if that's acceptable to them, then you could move on. I'm just saying.
Yeah, that's the whole point.
I'm saying
Yeah.
just lean in just a little bit more.
Oh, I think I lean in quite a bit. And that's why the more you lean in and get disappointed, the more you're frustrated and mock it in the end.
I was just using that as an example.
Well, for example, if I kept talking to this person, they want to start teaching creationism in schools, in the public schools, and debunking evolution. I'm going to really be heavily against that. And I'm actually coming across people who are actually proposing that seriously.
Yeah.
So they're out there. That person is not going to be my friend in system design.
So this is probably going to be my checkout since we're about 6 minutes before the top of the hour. I just want to do a little bit of clarification. I am not against all work that light workers, quote unquote, are doing. The only aspect of the light worker activity that I object to is validating that there are multiple different forms of truth and multiple different sources of truth. To the extent that that can be observed and tested and verified and leaned into and elaborated and investigated and inquired, I'm all for it. I'd love to see it. But until then, if those beliefs, those statements, those claims, those truths stand only on their own without a firmer basis in observation, questioning, then I think that's a disservice to the rest of society. That's my clarification. All in all, I love a lot of what light workers are doing. But that dilution of truth is dangerous. And it must be prevented, in my opinion. Over and
Okay.
out.
That's
I'll check it.
dilution.
Okay,
That's
don't leave. Don't leave
Yeah.
until so as a light worker, I will say that just like every Christian doesn't act the way a Christian would act for whatever reason, every person who claims to be a light worker is not necessarily acting as a light worker would act. So that's why I pushed back in the
Yeah.
chat about, talking
Right,
about
and
light workers.
And there you need personal Venn diagrams, because one person's light is not another person's light, apparently.
So, yeah. Has Sam left?
Yes, I think so.
I'm still here while I'm getting ready to go elsewhere, but
Because there was one thing I wanted to share today, and I haven't had time to share it. And I wanted you especially to hear it because I think it relates to a lot of things. So did you have time for it's a little thing I want to read. You don't have to respond to it, but maybe we can talk about it later. Okay, I'll just read it because I think that there's a deeper issue that's underneath all this. And this is something that somebody wrote. I think it describes it very well. They were unaware that their relationships with language and ideas, with identity and meaning, were being fundamentally transformed over time in ways they had little chance of becoming aware of. For these were the assets upon which their awareness was founded, and they were changing them unconsciously by reforging the foundations of meaning and identity in the images of their tool inventions, by relation with machines and the transfer of the resulting metaphors back into the origin and nature of their own minds and world ideas. Over time, a cascade of crises ensued as meaning and identity collapsed into language, and the nature of language itself transformed under the influence of broadcasting it. Eventually, the old precedents of consciousness over language collapsed, and language began to induce consciousness in its image, so that rather than having minds, they had statements, swarms of them. And they propagated these and became repeaters, not for ideas or meaning, not for identity or sensing, for statements in language. The whole nature of their relationships with language transformed almost overnight as the declarative power of mere words became entrancing and hygienic. Declarations in language began to overwhelm the minds that previously presided over them, producing something almost mindless, a contagious, invisible, machine-like presence in their consciousness that inhibited anything that wasn't rendered in its image. Thus it was that at the end of the second decade of the 21st century, seen as a community, the common people were in a situation they were as helpless to recognize as they were to amend. Yet this wasn't the first time something like this took place. Indeed, it was but the latest reiteration of a process even our distant ancestors were familiar with. And they left us stories about its origins, and even about the antidotes. Yeah. So that was a fragment that was
Well,
shared
let's definitely
by-
take that up at an opportunity. Maybe you should take one of the Saturdays coming up, Glenn.
Sure. Next Saturday is possible. Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Okay, I gotta go too. Thank you. Great session.